With that, Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This amendment attempts to keep information secret. The reality is, the suggestion by my friends on the other side of the aisle that you can already find this by going online, it's available to the American people, is absolutely not true. If you look at the second paragraph of this amendment, it says any payment or expenditure, independent expenditure, disbursement.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't until I'm finished.
Thank you, Mr.
And that means that a whole range of expenditures can be made and be kept secret. Disclosure is the bedrock. Transparency is the bedrock of our democracy. What we want to ensure is that the American people have confidence that when their money is being expended through this contracting process, that there's integrity there, and that decisions are being made based on merit. And they have a right to information that they can then consider to determine if that is in fact the case. And so knowing and learning information about money being expended in this way is information the American people are entitled to know. They know it about us because it contributes to their thinking about where we stand on issues. They're entitled to know that when it involves the expenditure of millions and billions of dollars. And it is very important that the American people have confidence in this process. And I know I hear from my constituents, there's distrust about the way money is spent in Washington, about the influence of money on our political system. Part of the answer to that is disclosure. I ask the question back, why do you want to keep this a secret? Why don't you think the American people are entitled to know this information? The American people are smart. They can discern whether it has had an influence or not, but share this information. What is the benefit of keeping secret the kind of expenditures that this amendment attempts to keep secret? There is a fix. There's an executive order that's been at least talked about that fixes this. This amendment is designed to stop that fix. So when my friends say, oh, there's the way to fix it, change the law, there's also a way to fix it by executive order. But if this amendment passes, it will end the transparency that an executive order would bring about. The American people have a right to learn what is being spent to influence our democracy and the extent that it has some impact on contracting decisions. And it's one way that we can rebuild the trust of the American people in this process. The notion that we should enact an amendment that will codify keeping secret from the American people millions and millions of dollars in spending to influence our democracy because they don't have a right to know that information or somehow they'll misunderstand it is insulting to the American people. Disclosure is central to our democracy. We ought to have this kind of transparency in every department and state in our national government so the American people can rest. And I'm happy to yield.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm assuming then under that criteria that you think that someone also should disclose whether or not they are a member of a union and disclose which union they are a member of and how much dues they've paid to that union.
Well, I'm reclaiming my time. I think this amendment would cover, will allow secrecy for union expenditures as well, because it says any entity. I think that the disclosure I'm talking about ought to exist for all expenditures from any entity. But I think sharing information with the American people about the expenditures that are being made, both directly and indirectly, to influence elections, any notion that we strengthen our democracy by keeping those things secret and keeping them away from the American people, I think misses the mark. And
Gentlemen,
I'm going to just finish. The disclosure requirements that we should all be working toward. You know, we heard so much yesterday about transparency and so much about the right of the American people to know things about their government, and I couldn't agree more. But we all know the influence and the importance that money plays in our political system, much to the detriment of our system. And in the area of contracting, where we saw examples in my first days in Congress where weapon systems were being purchased even though the Pentagon didn't want them, the American people have the right to know if, in fact, expenditures help to influence those kinds of decisions. Disclosure is good. Transparency is good. The American people deserve that. They deserve to know how this democracy is being influenced by this kind of spending, and I urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment.
Thank you. Having, Mr. Wilson, yes, is recognized.
I yield to the congressman from Arkansas, Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Griffin.
Griffin.
Bishop Griffin, that's fine. Thank you. I just wanted to say that if you look at my positions, both on this and elsewhere, I will tell you that I am a big advocate for transparency and disclosure. This is not about the American people seeing these names. This is about the federal government requiring that you submit it to them when you are trying to get a contract. And I can see a situation where we're in Administration A, and my beliefs are the opposite of Administration A, and I know I do a lot of government work. I'm not going to want to give to candidates that I would support because I'm afraid that Administration A is going to see my page after page of political affiliation. It's not about the American people seeing it. It's like I said, if you want to change the law so that there is disclosure for all of these other groups, then let's work on a bipartisan bill that includes unions. Let's talk about that. That doesn't make exceptions. I'm all for that. The sticking point in this Congress has been unions and carve-outs. I'm willing to say disclose it all. Let's work on a comprehensive law. That's not what this is about. Sure, this accomplishes a sliver of that, but it does it through forcing disclosure to the federal government. Now, I don't think your whip is against transparency. I don't think Mr. Connolly, who's not here right now, is against transparency. I don't think Mr. Meeks, who voted for this, is against transparency. I don't think Mr. Chandler's against transparency. I think they're for it. They also voted for this on the floor. So clearly, if you are for this, you don't necessarily buy into the argument that you made. Someone might, but, you know, I happen to agree with your colleague, Mr. Connolly, on this and the whip. So, look, we could disagree on it, but we don't have to demonize each other and act as if someone wants to keep something secret. The reason that I am for this, the same reason they're for it, same reason your whip's for it, is because it is providing information to the federal government when you are seeking a contract.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
No. It is not.
It's not the gentleman's time.
It is not because that you want to keep something from someone. And you know, we've been through all of these arguments. We've heard yours. You've heard ours. And we can just agree to disagree, but I just don't think the federal government ought to be requesting this information when people are seeking contracts with it. I yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina.
And I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Falama-Vega is recognized.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Just wanted to ask Mr. Griffin just one or two questions on his
Mr. Griffin?
proposed amendment.
Mr. Griffin, Mr. Falama-Vega would
Gentleman
like
from Arkansas, I note with interest that
Yes, sir.
the proposed amendment is not an amendment to a current law or a regulation. It seems to be a new section in and of itself as a prohibition about. What I'm saying is that at the current procedures, if I were to offer or wanted to make a contract or win a contract from the federal government, is the current system I have to reveal campaign contributions as part of that requirement, or is it something that we want to do it in advance without even I just want to understand more from the gentleman. What is the current procedure, since I don't see anything as an amendment from the current statutory requirement or regulation?
Sure.
Will the gentleman help me
Mr.
on
Griffin.
Yes. There are a number of regulations with regard to folks seeking contracts with the federal government. There is not this disclosure. Otherwise, you know, I don't think the President would be proposing it. I can tell you, I will tell you a couple of the aspects of the current law. Current law bars contractors from making political contributions during the negotiation and performance of a contract. Federal law already prohibits contractors from using appropriated funds for lobbying or political activity, so we're not talking about those funds. Under the Byrd Amendment to the Lobbying Disclosure Act, contractors may not use appropriated funds to pay lobbyists to attempt to influence executive or alleged branch personnel with regard to the contract. Current disclosure rules require all political contributions to federal candidates, parties, or party committees to be reported to the FEC, obviously. Yes, there are some entities that this Congress has not required to make disclosure. And again, if we want to address that writ large, we can address that separately. Any political committee affiliated with a bidding entity that contributes to federal candidates, parties, or party committees must also report that to the FEC. Those are some of the rules.
Yeah, reclaiming my time. So I think the gentleman can understand and appreciate that there are provisions in our current election laws just to lessen or to prohibit any sense of conflict of interest and to make sure that it isn't just with corporations. Any entity, which I would consider to be entity meaning labor unions or any organization that wants to make a bid for a contract from the federal government, is under the scrutiny of the federal law, making sure that if you win a contract, it's because of the merits and not because you were a friend of the administrator or by some reason you had there wasn't even a bidding process. I think that's the whole thrust of what I understand why we have these election laws, is just to prohibit even the appearance of a conflict of interest is what we're trying to do. In the name of transparency, it seems that this is what we really were trying to do. And I'd like to yield some time to Mr. Deutch.
Mr. Deutch?
my
He wants to
friend.
make a few points that he hasn't made before, right?
I wanted to ask a couple of questions, Madam Chairman. In light of the recent comments by the amendment sponsor, if we understand that there are all of these important disclosure requirements, all of these important prohibitions already incorporated into our laws, and the concern seems to be that we shouldn't disclose because the only party that will utilize this information is the government. I wonder, as we look ahead to our efforts to try to craft bipartisan legislation to try to require fuller disclosure, I wonder if the amendment sponsor would have a different view of these issues if perhaps we required not only the disclosure of this information from any corporation, but specifically the disclosure of the information from any union that wishes to enter into a contract with the government. And finally, that we take that information and don't simply leave it up to the government, but post all of that information on the internet, just like the amendment that we passed last evening with regard to some other salary information.
Is that a question for Mr. Griffin?
It is a question for Mr. Griffin.